First, we import TensorFlow as TF, then we print the TensorFlow version that we are using. We are using TensorFlow 1.0.1. We start by building the computational graph. That is, we define the variables and computations that will take place. However, it's important to note that nothing is evaluated at this time. We're going to create two TensorFlow variables that will hold random numbers. So here is random underscore tensor underscore var underscore 1. We use the TensorFlow.variable functionality, TensorFlow.random uniform. The tensor is going to be of shape 2 by 3 by 4, min value 0, max value 10, data type is int 32. Next, we define a second TensorFlow variable the same way. The Python variable that we assign it to is random underscore tensor underscore var underscore 2. Next, we're going to print the two variables. First, we print random underscore tensor underscore var underscore 1, and we see that it is a tensor, but we don't see any values because it hasn't been initialized yet. Then we print random tensor var 2. And you can see that for both variables, they are TensorFlow variables. However, because they haven't been initialized, the print functionality just tells us what it is. It doesn't tell us the values. So random underscore tensor underscore add underscore result is going to create a TensorFlow variable using the TensorFlow.add functionality. That's going to add our random tensor var1 plus random tensor var2. And then we can print the tensor and see that it is a variable, but again, because we have not initialized it or evaluated it, it does not hold any values. Now that we have created and defined all of the operations of the computational graph, it's time to run the computational graph we built. So we launch the graph in a session, and then we initialize all the global variables in the graph. Whoops! So we get a TensorFlow error. The error that we get is failed precondition error, parentheses see above for traceback, attempting to use uninitialized value variable. What happened here is that we have three TensorFlow variables. Random tensor var1, random tensor var2, and random tensor add result. The trouble is that we do not know the order of how the global variable initializer initializes variables. That is, TensorFlow initializes the variables in a non-deterministic order. That means the global variable initializer can exhibit different behaviors on different runs, so we have no way to predict which variables are going to be initialized before other variables. So when the random tensor add result tries to get initialized, adding random tensor var1 plus random tensor var2, either one or both of the random tensor var1 or random tensor var2 may not have been initialized yet, so it throws the error. To solve this, we have to define operations that will use the initialized values of TensorFlow tensors or variables in a specific way that tells the global variable initializer to use the initialized values and not to try to use the TensorFlow objects before they are initialized. The way we're going to do this is by using the TensorFlow initialized underscore value functionality. Let's quit the session and try again. We start our Python interpreter again. We import TensorFlow. We define our two TensorFlow variables again. Random tensor var1 first, and then random tensor var2. Then we define the random tensor add result variable. Specifically, we want to make sure that we are using the dot initialize value open parentheses close parentheses functionality for each of them, which tells the global variable initializer to wait until random tensor var1 and random tensor var2 have been initialized before it tries to do the TensorFlow.add functionality. So that way random tensor add result is using initialized values for the addition of both tensors. Now that we have created and defined all of the operations of the computational graph, it's time to run the computational graph we built. So we launch the graph in a session. Now we initialize all the global variables in the graph. And bingo, notice that we didn't get any error. So now that we've done this, we can print out our three TensorFlow variables to see what we got. First, we print out random tensor var1, then we print out random tensor var2, and now we print the addition of random tensor var1 plus random tensor var2. We can look at the last line of each tensor to do a visual double check. So 3 plus 3 is 6, 9 plus 2 is 11, 6 plus 7 is 13, 7 plus 7 is 14. It worked, and it didn't throw an error. The last thing we do is we close the TensorFlow session to release the TensorFlow resources we used within this session as they're no longer required. And that is how you can initialize TensorFlow variables that depend on other TensorFlow variables by using the TensorFlow initialized underscore value functionality.